Hello, this short video today is over frequency and histograms. So there are many ways to organize and display data, and sometimes it's useful to organize and to display data into intervals, and this is where a frequency table would come into play. So a frequency table tells us the number of times an event or category or group occurs. So what you're going to do is if you're given a set of data, you're then going to go ahead and you're going to choose equal intervals. So when I say equal intervals, I mean choose like groups of 10 or groups of 5. You can't have a mixture of some 10, some 5, some 2s, like they all have to be even. You then will go ahead and you are going to find how many of your data values occur in each interval. And we're going to organize this by using a table. So let's look at this example. We're going to make a frequency table of how many pages were read per student last weekend. So we have these 10 students, and instead of looking at the individual data, I want to group them. So I'm going to group them in groups of 10, and the reason is I have numbers between 5 and 40. So for me, going from intervals of 10 makes sense. Now, you have to be the judge of this. There's no right or wrong set of intervals, but it wouldn't make sense for me to do intervals of 20 because then I would only have two groups. It wouldn't make sense to do groups of 2 because I would have some intervals of data that didn't have any data in it. So for me, this choice was sets of 10. So then I'm going to go through and I'm just going to, in my table here, I'm just going to go ahead and for the time being put tally marks for each set of data for where it occurs. And you'll see I'm crossing them off in my table, so then it's easy for me to see, okay, I've hit all of them. I don't want to forget any of my data points. Once I have done that, I can go ahead and I can add them. So let's see. I had 2 students read between 1 and 10 pages. 4 students read between 11 and 20. 1 student read between 21 and 30. And 3 students read between 31 and 40. I can also tell this is a good set of interval because I have data in all 4 sets. With this data then, I can go ahead and I can make a histogram. A histogram is very similar to a bar graph. The difference is histograms show the number of data that something occurs. So you have intervals and it shows how many times something occurs. A bar graph is category. So for instance, how many people like the color blue? How many like green? How many like red? So you would have blue, green, red. Where this is using the numbers. So I would have just like my Instagram or my histogram would be how many people like the color blue, and then my intervals would be 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30 people. So be careful because a bar graph shows categories where a histogram is for numerical data using intervals, and you will notice a histogram the bars touch where a bar graph it doesn't. So to make a histogram, you would choose the appropriate scale and interval. You're going to draw the number of students in this case, because remember we're doing the number of pages read per student, and our bars should touch. They don't overlap, but they touch. And then you have to remember to title the graph and label the axes. So we would just take, so you can see here I had from my table, my intervals here were 1 and 10, 11 and 20, 21 and 30, 31 to 40. And my highest group was 4 students. So my axes here, I just went up to 5 because the highest I had was 4. And then again, just make sure you remember to always label your graph so people know what they're looking at. And the reason I might display this data in a histogram is this is easier for me to visually look at right away and say, okay, I can see most of my students read between 11 and 20 and 31 and 40. Not very many of my students read between 21 and 30. So visually, I can real quick look at it and say, boom, this is what's going on. So they're very, very helpful when organizing and reading data. So let's go ahead and let's practice for a minute. So given this histogram, I want to know how would we read this chart, or what is this chart telling me? So I need to pay attention here to my axes in my title. So my x-axis is my tacos sold. My y-axis is my frequency. So this is saying 1 to 5 tacos were sold for, I would say, maybe that's a little above 400, but approximately we'll say 400 times. I had between 6 and 10 taco orders. What is that, like 800 so times. So this is telling me the frequency of how many tacos were sold, probably per order. So if I want to know how many tables bought between 1 and 5 tacos, I would say, okay, well 1 to 5, it's right here. This correlates to right over here. So I'm going to say approximately around 400 tables ordered between 1 and 5 tacos. With histograms, there are ways we can analyze. There's 3 common shapes. We have uniform, symmetric, and skewed. Uniform is when the bars are roughly the same height. So if you see here, each of my bars, they're close to being the same height. Symmetric is when if I drew an imaginary line down the middle of my histogram, I could fold it in half and it kind of mirrors itself, kind of like a butterfly. It would be pretty close to the same. Now remember, they're not going to be exact, like parabolas. You know, when we folded those parabolas in half with the quadratics, it mirrored each other. It better be the same. That's not necessarily the case here. We're just saying it's close to being the same. Skewed histogram would be when it's really common that there's one peak and it's not in the center. It's either skewed to the left or skewed to the right. So, looking again at our taco example, which of the histogram types most closely matches the taco histogram? All right, so let's go through them. Uniform. Remember, uniform is when they're all approximately the same height. Now, I would say this is not uniform. Not all my histograms are the same height. Symmetric is when we can draw this imaginary line, fold it in half, and they're pretty close to being the same. I would say, yeah, this could be symmetric because my histograms right next to my center are pretty close, and then my histograms in the far left and right are pretty close to being the same. I would not say this is skewed. This is not skewed because I don't necessarily have a huge peak one way or the other. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say this is symmetric. And okay, so the next question says the taco stand owner wants to know the total number of tacos sold. So he wants to know how many tacos did they sell. We would make what is called a cumulative frequency table. This is when you add up each interval to get the total amount of data you used. So 1 to 5, I said there was 425 tables that ordered between 1 and 5 tacos. Between 6 and 10, it looks like 869 tables. 11 to 15 was 801, and 16 to 20 was 214. You add all of these values together. So you can see I did 425, and then my next line was 425 plus 869. My third one was I take the value from before, so I did the 425 plus 869 plus the 801. And lastly, then I added the 214. So here's my cumulative frequency. So this is telling me from 1 to 10 altogether, I would had 1,294 orders. So if I had to show this as a histogram, you could see cumulative frequency, it's going to be a skewed graph to the right because your graph should be growing because you are adding each value of those histograms together. So if I describe this, I would say this is a skewed graph because it is like almost like, think of it as like steps. It's going up. So hopefully this was a good short little lesson on frequency and histograms. You have questions, need additional help, don't hesitate to reach out to your teacher. Have a good one, guys.